My name's Ed Sims. I'm a professional company director and a consultant to a number of organizations. I've spent most of my career in transportation, in retail, wholesale, customer-facing, highly competitive industries. I spent half of my career in the UK in tour operating and in charter airlines, and then came to New Zealand to work for Air New Zealand and spent 10 years as part of their executive team. I then went to Wellington to run the country's air traffic control organisation, Airways, where I was chief executive for 6 years. And then myself and my family migrated to Canada, where I ran Canada's second largest airline, WestJet, for 5 years, including the last 2 years of COVID. So I'm very happy to be home, very happy to be now working on a diverse range of products, and very happy with the experiences that I've been able to gain over the last 35 years. I took a really conscious decision to take my strategic leadership program with Jeff Lorrigan and the team at ISL. I'd spent the first half of my career in the UK, hence my accent. That was an interesting time in the UK. It really didn't put a premium on leadership. There were a lot of bad things happened in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up in my corporate career. There were terrible accidents, the Herald of Free Enterprise, Piper Alpha, Martian S. It was a time when people didn't really focus on the people around them. It was almost as if there wasn't enough emphasis on health and safety and the safety of your colleagues in the workplace. And it was a pretty dog-eat-dog environment, to be honest. I remember vividly the very first time I was introduced to a concept called Myers-Briggs. And people will remember Myers-Briggs perhaps comparing extroverts to introverts or thinking to feeling. And I remember working for a chief executive of a major PLC. I was part of the executive team. And I remember him vividly saying, if I've got any Fs in my team, that F is going to stand for F off. And I remember thinking, wow, I don't think that's actually how it should be done. So I spent quite a bit of time in the UK probably learning more from negative examples than from positive examples. So I joined Air New Zealand, and Air New Zealand, I found at the time, this was around 2001, was a very holistic environment, quite unlike some of the working environments that I was used to in the UK. And my boss at the time, a guy called Rob Fife, had come across ISL and suggested that this would be a good environment for me. And I just remember feeling like there were just light bulbs going on all over the place during the course of the ISL. And it really, I think, helped me migrate from being a manager to something that I would truly define as a leader. The biggest challenges that I was facing prior to the course were really ones of range and being a truly diverse leader. I was a very driven individual. I used to work exceptionally long hours. I was very focused in single disciplines and in single technical disciplines. So I was an expert in marketing, in revenue management, in networks, very focused on the commercial world. And I hadn't really considered the broader world where people were doing jobs rather than developing careers. They were operating in the operational environment. It could be pilots, flight attendants, ground handlers, engineers. I really was used to working with people more like myself, and I hadn't stepped into environments where people were doing a very different type of job and would accept me even if I hadn't come from their pure technical discipline. Before I went on ISL, I'd taken more courses focused on technical development and deepening technical competencies. What I hadn't encountered before I went on ISL was the focus on self-awareness. And of course, when you go on some of those technical development courses, you can hide, you can rest on your technical competence, and you can contribute when you think you need to. But with ISL, you can't hide. It's about you. It's about your self-development and self-awareness. And it would be like hiding in an athletics discipline. You're only cheating yourself. So the thing I loved about ISL was it really drew you out of yourself and forced you to hold a mirror up to the real you, which was probably the first time I'd undertaken that. Yeah, I felt pretty intimidated when I first arrived at Millbrook, to be honest. I knew there'd be other, probably more senior leaders than myself or from larger organizations. Even though I was part of the executive suite at Air New Zealand, I was pretty conscious that there were going to be people from great companies like Fletcher's and Fonterra, who may well have had much longer experience than myself. But I found the environment immediately very welcoming. They went to great lengths to ensure that people introduced themselves, that the people didn't feel self-conscious about the environment or the background they came from. So everybody was immediately at ease, pretty much from the first moment. There's a number of key moments that bring back fantastic memories. Firstly, the whole outdoor environment. I mean, I don't think you can help but be in the basin of Queenstown and be inspired by looking up at Coronet Peak, by looking at the Remarkables and feeling there are forces much bigger than yourself in that kind of environment. But I think the other key moments were really when you started working as a syndicate. And when that small syndicate, and there were people from the public sector, there were people from NGOs, very different environments to mine. And when they start giving you feedback about how you show up, that's when you realize you really can't escape. That's when you realize you've got to confront yourself, strengths and weaknesses. And the thing I loved about the syndicate is they did spend a lot of time focusing on your strengths. So there was an awful lot of positive affirmation. The other thing that I remember really distinctly was when we were asked to work on a given program, and we were asked to work to a very realistic, tight timescale. You know, our particular program was a not-for-profit. It's not a sector that I know terribly well, but we were asked to really almost rebuild their whole business strategy from scratch, and for that business as if it were your organization, as if it were your entity. And I remember the sense of camaraderie, the sense of collaboration that happened when we all had to work on that really brought us together as a team. And that was a tremendous light bulb moment. Yeah, what I've learned from ISL that I've been able to carry through in my career is what I would describe as the power of being a broad generalist rather than a deep technical specialist. You know, I'm not a great business book reader, but there's a book called Range by a guy called David Epstein. And he says that, you know, in benign environments, technical specialism can take you to the top of an organization. But in what he calls wicked times, you need to be a generalist, and you need to have a range of technical, operational, creative, financial, people skills that really stemmed for me from my time at ISL, because it was the first time that I'd taken a deep appreciation of skills outside my subject matter expertise. And you know, I don't think I could have got through a crisis like COVID but for the range I learned from ISL, because you have to put yourself in other people's shoes, and you have to be able to understand the particular pressures that they're going through, which are a world away, perhaps from your particular area of expertise. And it was really ISL, and as I said, associating with people from not-for-profits, from public sector, that really taught me the ability to project and become a true generalist. Yeah, I think some of the other aspects that I carried through from ISL, you sometimes have, I feel, positive influences on your shoulder. And, you know, if I think particularly about Jeff Lorigan, I'm sure we were not the only group, and probably not the first group, to refer to him as Yoda. But we really thought of him as this kind of wise voice that I still think of on my shoulder. And I still check myself sometimes, even it's almost 20 years on, finding myself thinking, what would Jeff do in these circumstances? How would Jeff respond? So I think it's not just the quality of the peer groups that you're with and their diversity, the quality of the facilitators, the lives they've led and the lessons that they teach are something that you carry with you, I think, for the rest of your life. Yeah, well, I'm tempted in terms of thinking about what lessons to learn from me is don't follow me, because I've probably made more mistakes than I've made good choices through my career. But, you know, the first thought that strikes me is careers are a lattice work, they're not a ladder. You've got to get used to going sideways, you've got to get used to going back in your career development, and accept that as part of your learning, and accept that as broadening you out as a person without thinking that you're constantly on the upward trail. I think one of the other key lessons that I'd encourage others to consider, and this very much came from my time with ISL, is understanding your own values and aligning those with the values of the organization that you work for. It's not a question of listening to somebody else's values. I can recount my values: accountability, aspiration, authenticity, humility, resilience. I talk about them, and I talk about them because of my time at ISL, who encouraged me to be open about my values. But that's not the point. The point is not my values. The point is, whenever I've gone into an organization, I aim to understand their values and try to make sure that there is a complete alignment. Because if you work for an organization with whom ethically or morally you feel there's a misalignment with your own personal values, it doesn't matter what role you're going into, it's just not going to work. So the main piece of advice I'd give anybody in terms of thinking about how my career developed into some, thankfully very senior roles, is always listen to your values and make sure that the company you're working for can either incorporate those values or thinks the same way you do.